Greetings, all. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Alex Bell, and on behalf of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, I am pleased to welcome you to this virtual event today. This is part of a series that we host connecting the public to the scientists and policy experts at the forefront of the work to reduce existential risks. Today, we're diving in on the negotiations around the Iranian nuclear program, a topic that is back in the news, and we're lucky to be joined by three leading experts in the field. Kelsey Davenport, the Director for Nonproliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association; Richard Nephew, a Senior Research Scholar in the Faculty of International and Public Affairs and Adjunct Professor of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University; and Sina Tusi, a Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Center for International Policy. As I said, we're going to be talking today about the Iranian nuclear program, specifically the prospects of a new nuclear deal between the US, Iran, with, of course, potentially Russia, China, and the EU helping to form such a deal if we were to follow the model of the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, also known as the JCPOA, or more commonly, the Iran deal. So let's start there. Kelsey, you ran the very helpful P4+1 and Iran nuclear deal alert newsletter back when the Iran deal was coming together during the Obama administration. Can you talk us through what that deal looked like for those who don't remember from about 10 years ago and what happened to it?
Great. Well, thank you so much, Alex, and thanks to the Bulletin for hosting this really important and timely event. It's great to be here, and my thanks to the audience for tuning in. So to really understand the 2015 nuclear deal, we have to go back a few decades to see how this agreement resolved really a decades-long crisis over Iran's nuclear program that stemmed from Iran's illicit attempts to develop nuclear weapons from the mid-'80s to 2003. And although the nuclear weapons program ended in 2003, Iran did continue to advance its nuclear program, particularly its ability to enrich uranium over the next decade, while it engaged in intermittent negotiations with first the Europeans and then the group that Alex described known as the P5+1. And during that decade, from 2003 to 2013, we saw a US-led effort to really put concerted pressure on Iran, primarily through sanctions, to encourage them to negotiate over their nuclear program and limit that program to ensure that Iran remained in compliance with its nuclear nonproliferation treaty obligations going forward, and to ensure that any move towards nuclear weapons in the future would be quickly detected. So this decade of kind of pressure and diplomacy culminated in the 2015 nuclear deal, known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And this agreement itself proved to be a very effective and verifiable non-proliferation agreement. And I would highlight three aspects from the non-proliferation side that I think were particularly important. The first has to do with the constraints it put on Iran's ability to produce fissile material. Now, you can build a nuclear weapon using either plutonium, or weapons-grade uranium. And Iran has more developed its uranium enrichment program. So on the uranium enrichment side, when the deal was being negotiated, had Iran chosen to build nuclear weapons, it could have produced enough weapons-grade uranium in about 2 to 3 months. Through a combination of limits put in place by the deal, limiting the enrichment level, so the concentration of enrichment that Iran could produce, and putting constraints on the number of centrifuges and the type of centrifuges, as well as the stockpile of material kept in Iran, that time frame increased to about a year, and it would have remained about a year for a little more than a decade. So very strong constraints on the uranium enrichment program that would have given the international community plenty of time to respond if Iran were to kind of return to nuclear weapons development. The plutonium pathway restrictions, even stronger. The deal really effectively blocked Iran's ability to separate plutonium for 15 years, likely indefinitely. So very strong there. The second aspect I would highlight were weaponization prohibitions. The deal prevented Iran from conducting certain activities that were relevant to building a nuclear explosive device. And this is important because Iran had experimented in these areas in the past, but claimed that these activities were for non-nuclear weapons purposes. So conventional explosives, oil drilling, but the deal ensured that Iran could no longer undertake these activities. But I think most critical about the JCPOA was it put in place a highly intrusive, multi-layered monitoring regime that really covered every aspect of Iran's fuel cycle. So the IAEA had continuous surveillance at key sites, beginning with Iran's mining of uranium, all the way through the enrichment process. They had access to any location in Iran within a certain number of days if there were concerns about illicit activities. And the IAEA was able to use some innovative technologies in monitoring that allowed even enrichment monitoring in real time. So very, very intrusive monitoring. And then in return for that, Iran received sanctions relief. Now, the deal was implemented in January of 2016, and the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, charged with monitoring it, U.S. intelligence community, all of these agencies assessed that Iran was complying with its obligations under the deal and complying with them even in May of 2018 when the Trump administration withdrew from the deal. And I think that's important to note because it really underscores the credibility deficit that the United States now faces in negotiations with Iran, and Iran's concern about the U.S. Willingness to abide by a deal in the future. Trump, cited other areas of concern, Iran's missile program, its regional activities as reasons why the U.S. withdrew. But I think, again, it's important to emphasize that from a nuclear perspective, the deal was being implemented and it was effective. A year after Trump pulled out, Iran began to violate its commitments under the JCPOA and really now has advanced its nuclear program to the place where we can say that Iran is on the threshold of nuclear weapons. So it's moved to higher levels of enrichment. It's expanded that program. If the decision were made now to develop nuclear weapons, it could do so very quickly. So the proliferation risk right now is quite serious. It's quite urgent. And I think it demands the United States, put what I would say even more urgency into addressing this through diplomacy. But I know we're going to talk about that more going forward. So I will stop there and look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thanks for that, Kelsey. A really good framing of where we were. So moving to you, Richard, it sounds like we had a deal. It was working. It did not deal with all of the problems that we have with Iran, but on the deal itself, it was being implemented properly. The Trump administration chose to leave that deal, and you came in. You worked a little bit, of course, a lot on this during the Obama administration, and then again during the Biden administration. So do you have things to add to what Kelsey said? And then can you talk a little bit about what the Biden administration inherited and attempted to do in the previous 4 years?
Yeah, I've got a fair amount of gray hair from a few decades on this one. So look, I would say a couple things. The theory of the case for withdrawal from the JCPOA, and this was pretty clearly stated by the Trump administration at the time, was not that the JCPOA was failing at the moment. Right. There were reports, pretty consistent reports coming out of the Trump administration that Iran was in compliance, and nobody's in dispute on any of those things. The theory was that Iran would eventually cheat, and or if they didn't cheat, eventually Iran would get nuclear weapons because they had a patient path to the bomb, as some critics would say. And this all links to the idea of sunsets, and that parts of the nuclear program's restrictions and transparency system would sunset over various different periods of time. And the calendar is elaborate, but basically you can mark it at 8 years, 10 years, 15 years, and 20 years as basically being the time level for various different things to go away. And the idea was that if we're going to have a crisis with Iran, let's have a crisis now. And so all of those people who wanted to have a crisis, they got their wish. They get to have a crisis now. And that crisis is taking place amid a whole lot of different dynamics that are taking place in the region. And after many different attempts to get negotiations back under some sort of process during the Biden administration. As you point out, when President Biden was elected, inaugurated, he came in and wanted to get back into the JCPOA. It was our explicit policy aim. And we set about trying to have negotiations with the Iranians to do that. They declined to have direct talks while the maximum pressure sanctions put in place by the Trump administration were still in place. And the Biden administration never actually formally relaxed any of those. And so instead, we had a series of indirect talks, essentially from April of 2021 until September-ish of 2022. And the theory of this was that we were going to try and find ways in which we can get back into the JCPOA with a compliance for compliance framework, but updating the JCPOA in a couple places where it needed to be updated because time had moved on. Some of the new sanctions coming from the United States had changed the dynamics inside of Tehran. We had concerns about the dynamics inside of Iran because of the advanced centrifuge work that had taken place after Iran restarted some of its activities in May of 2019. That effort inevitably failed. And it failed really for two reasons. The first is that we, the Biden administration, couldn't convince the Iranians that Trump wouldn't become president again and wouldn't withdraw from the JCPOA again. Lo and behold, they were right. Couldn't stop that from happening, and so therefore couldn't stop the possibility of a U.S. withdrawal in the future. And this issue of guarantees hung over every single discussion, where the Iranians wanted to have some sort of certainty that the United States going back in meant the United States would stay in for the full duration of the JCPOA. Something that we were unwilling to say, and frankly legally couldn't say with any degree of certainty, even if a treaty had been put in place. The second big issue that we had was just a fundamental absence of trust that had been built up over the succeeding few years. The Iranians had continued to engage in regional activities that we found quite problematic, from support to Hezbollah to arming the Houthis, which again, now we see some of the manifestations from that. And the Iranians didn't have any trust in us because of that withdrawal. And so basically, by the time we got to December of 22, there was a real good faith effort put on the table by the Biden administration working with European partners that would have, I think, probably satisfied a lot of Iranian requirements, but couldn't get past the guarantees part, at least not in a way that was persuasive enough to the supreme leader. There were also some specific elements around the IRGC that were also problematic as well. And so the result was, from September of 22, essentially until today, we've not really had much beyond a series of kind of temporary measures where the U.S. and Iran would agree kind of unofficially not to escalate things too terribly much. But of course, maximum pressure sanctions are in place, and all the nuclear advancements that Kelsey was talking to are in place too, now. And of course, all of this, got even much worse after the October 7th attacks, which made it much more difficult to contemplate deals with the Iranians, which wouldn't, take into account regional issues. So where we are today, essentially, is a place where we've tried a deal. It worked, but it couldn't overcome political disagreements inside the United States. And on the basis of that, created a lot of uncertainties in the Iranian system that the current administration is attempting to overcome, and looking for different structures that might be different than the JCPOA. I think almost fundamentally would have to be different than the JCPOA, but might borrow from some of its more successful elements and provide a stronger basis for future work.
Thanks, Richard. And I definitely want to come back to the sunset clauses a little bit later, because I think this is a thing that if you're looking from the outside, if you haven't had experience as a negotiator, it might seem obvious that you would keep structures in place forever. So we'll come back to the difficulties of having forever structures. But Sina, it's a good segue to where we are now. I saw you posting over the weekend about the fourth round of talks happening in Oman. Obviously, the president has made some comments about the need in his mind for the Iranians to move quickly on these issues. So can you give us an overview of where you think things are standing currently?
Yes, sure. First of all, thank you, Alex and the Bulletin, for having us, and really learned a lot from the comments of my esteemed co-panelists. I think when it comes to Trump's current negotiations with Iran, it's helpful to first go into a little bit of more background. Trump, going back to his initial maximum pressure campaign and his Iran policy in his first term, always did express a desire for a deal with Iran. And among the various reasons attributed to his withdrawal, one that I have found compelling is that it was Obama's deal, that he wanted to kind of tarnish one of Obama's main foreign policy achievements, but ultimately get his own deal. But in his first term, he really went all in on this very escalatory policy. He appointed very hawkish advisors like John Bolton as national security advisor, Mike Pompeo as his Secretary of State. And we know now, based off Bolton's memoir and comments from Trump himself, how much those figures actually work to obstruct successful diplomacy and de-escalation with Iran occurring during his first term. And now coming to his second term, Trump, one of his main campaign promises consistently throughout his 2024 campaign was to get out of wars, stay out of wars, and reach a deal with Iran that he has emphasized that they just can't have a nuclear weapon. But we see that when he came to office in January, he came in this context where Richard and Kelsey pointed out that, Iran's nuclear program is massively expanded. But at the same time, Iran's domestic political landscape has undergone significant and important shifts. Most notably, we have a reformist president in office right now, Masoud Pezeshkian, who himself was elected last summer on a platform of pursuing diplomacy and de-escalation in Iran's foreign policy. So it does seem that at the beginning of Trump's administration, there was some alignment on a desire for a deal. And we saw, though, early on in Trump's administration, in February, he issued this memorandum reimposing maximum pressure sanctions. And when he did it, he said that I don't really want to do this. I want a deal. A lot of people want me to do this, but it was interesting in that regard. And he kept emphasizing that he wants a deal. But regardless, after he imposed that memorandum, we really saw a striking shift in the Iranian domestic rhetoric, where Khamenei, the Iranian supreme leader, came out and gave a speech after that and said that negotiations with America are dishonorable and irrational, and they won't reach anything productive for Iran. And then we had several weeks where the rhetoric from Pezeshkian, just from Khamenei on down, from Pezeshkian, the reformist government, and other centers of power in Iran, all kind of echoed a more intransigent line on negotiations with the United States, up until Trump sent a letter to Khamenei. And that letter, I believe it went out in March. And it seems, by the accounts we have of it in the public sphere, it was kind of more positive. It seems like whatever it was, it convinced the Iranians to come to the negotiating table. Khamenei gave a response. And we've had this process of negotiations that the Iranians say are indirect, that Trump has on occasion said are direct negotiations, but nevertheless, Oman is facilitating them. And this weekend, as you mentioned, we wrapped up the fourth round of these negotiations. And these negotiations have had ups and downs. Most importantly is that it is unclear what Trump's end game is. I mean, he himself has consistently said this thing of just no nuclear weapons, but some of his advisors, including his previous national security advisor, Mike Waltz, most recently, Steve Witkoff himself in an interview with Breitbart last week, have really emphasized this point that Iran needs to dismantle its nuclear program and have zero uranium enrichment. And these are historically been red lines for the Iranians. And so right now we're in this situation where Steve Witkoff made these remarks ahead of the fourth round of talks in Oman this past Sunday. And Steve Witkoff had actually said if those talks were not successful, if they were not fruitful, that the US would walk away. But lo and behold, after the fourth round on Sunday in Oman, both sides again have positive rhetoric. US officials have said the talks were encouraging. They're going to meet again this weekend. Trump in Riyadh this week has also had, again, this kind of disjointed rhetoric, but in some ways very meaningfully kind of constructive, I would argue, on Iran, where he really rebuked decades of US kind of interventionism in the Middle East. He denounced kind of failed attempts at nation building. His overall remarks really kind of were a rebuttal of regime change instigated by the US in the Middle East. And he said that he doesn't believe in permanent enemies when talking about Iran. And, he is kind of holding this prospect of not just a new nuclear deal, but potentially a transformed US-Iran relationship. Obviously, there's many obstacles to that, both in the US, both in Iran, various geopolitical realities. But one of the big differences since 2015 is that the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, they are supporting the negotiations and supporting a deal and supporting de-escalation with Iran, unlike in Trump's first term. And this is also leading to interesting new proposals, such as one for the Iranians, according to reports, And based on an actual report in the Bulletin, actually from former Iranian diplomat Hossein Mousavian and Princeton physicist Frank von Hippel, for a joint enrichment and nuclear fuel consortium in the Persian Gulf that can kind of satisfy the fuel needs for all these countries that are developing nuclear programs and build trust and transparency and have this kind of multilateral framework. So it seems like the Iranians have offered this. It remains to be seen if the other parties would agree, but the talks are moving forward. And as of yet, it's uncertain what conclusion they will reach, but it does seem that there's a political will on both sides to get a deal. You're muted, Alex.
Sorry. Thanks for that, Sina, and thanks for mentioning the idea that came out today in the New York Times. The idea of a uranium enrichment consortium in the region. It's an idea that came up in the Bulletin back in 2023. Those are not necessarily countries that always like to work together. So Kelsey, can you comment on the idea itself that the Trump administration has and of how to get a deal, whether or not there actually may be some softening among some in the idea of some type of uranium enrichment in Iran, and the general path that the administration's on at this point?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So, I mean, I agree with Sina that Trump's support for diplomacy with Iran and support for a deal has been a through line, consistently from his campaign, into the first few months of his presidency. And I think, he is looking for a deal that's mutually beneficial. So not just something where the U.S. benefits on the nonproliferation side, but also a deal that provides economic opportunities for U.S. businesses. But I think, the bottom line of what we're seeing is that Trump's agenda for a deal with Iran is driven by politics, not nonproliferation policy, and his desire to stay out of another conflict in the Middle East, which he views as kind of contrary to the America First agenda that was, a large part of his campaign and his foreign policy approach. Now, because of that sort of more politically oriented approach to negotiations, I think the nonproliferation goals, the specific objectives that the United States is looking for, remain very unclear and beyond the declaration that Iran should not have nuclear weapons. And as Sina mentioned, we've seen mixed messages about this key issue of uranium enrichment and whether Iran can retain that. Well, Iran has said very clearly that it will not agree to any deal that prohibits uranium enrichment. So I am concerned that the mixed messages, moving from Iran can have limited enrichment to Iran has to completely dismantle its nuclear program, to Iran can have reactors, but it has to find fuel somewhere else, that all of that sends a message to Iran that the U.S. Isn't serious, that the U.S. isn't focused, and I think raises risks for the future of the diplomatic process. So one thing I would like to see the Trump administration do is, as it's been consistent in its support for a deal, it needs to be consistent about what the objectives of a deal are. And I think the U.S. can get an agreement that allows Iran to retain uranium enrichment that could be highly effective and verifiable. I mean, the key is coming up with the right combination of limits on that uranium enrichment program, and more importantly, the right combination of intrusive monitoring mechanisms to ensure that if Iran were to move to nuclear weapons through either its declared program or trying to do so covertly, that the International Atomic Energy Agency would be well positioned to quickly detect any movement towards nuclear weapons, that the monitoring would ideally deter Iran from going down that path, and provide the international community with enough time to respond. So an effective deal with uranium enrichment is doable. And I think the US needs to continue making that clear to Iran if it wants these negotiations to continue. Now, on the kind of regional question, the regional nuclear landscape has shifted significantly since the original JCPOA was negotiated in 2015. So it's not just the politics that have shifted, but we've since seen the United Arab Emirates, invest in nuclear reactors. They're now running 4. Saudi Arabia is bidding for nuclear reactors. There's a lot of interest in smaller nuclear reactors amongst the Gulf countries. And I think that may be feeding into some of this idea that Iran is proposing about regional uranium enrichment. But I think doing that right now is quite challenging because it's not clear what the fuel needs of some of these countries are in the immediate future. Saudi Arabia hasn't even selected a reactor design yet. Iran's only completed reactor, is still being fueled, or only completed power reactor is still being fueled by the Russians. So I think regional enrichment, that's challenging. But I do think the idea of trying to build ties between, epistemic communities, between Iran and the Gulf states, increasing interactions between scientists, I think all of that could be beneficial, if layered on top of a deal to provide additional transparency and non-proliferation benefits. Scientist to scientist engagement can be incredibly beneficial in terms of, deconfliction, clarifying intentions. And there could be ways to do that that are less, sensitive than, the sharing of enrichment technology. And I think less challenging technically, given where states are kind of in their nuclear program development. We could look at, nuclear safety. You could look at nuclear security. I mean, there's a lot you could do thinking about, response and mitigation in the event of a nuclear accident in the region. So I would look at kind of trying to engage the region that way, maybe with the eventual goal of moving towards some type of cooperative fuel arrangement or some type of, cooperative regional, inspections or safeguards regime.
Thanks, Kelsey. Richard, Kelsey brought up the idea or the issue of a conflict over the Iranian nuclear program. Is there a military solution to this issue? And if there is, what would be the regional consequences of such a conflict?
Well, the word solution is doing a lot of work there. Look, I mean, ultimately, are there military choices that could significantly impede Iran's ability to develop nuclear weapons? I mean, the answer to that is yes, right? Iran's declared and known nuclear facilities are well profiled by the United States military and presumably by other militaries as well. There are plans that are in place to be able to target them militarily. The problem that you always get into is, okay, and then what happens, right? And some of the theories that have been advanced by people who've advocated military action gives you the impression of you drop a bunch of bombs and then the problem is solved because the nuclear program is dead. But the reality is the Iranians have demonstrated time and time again a remarkable, maybe that's the wrong word, a unremarkable willingness to reconstruct things that have been taken away from them by other parties. And you can see this actually most directly in the April 2021 attack on Iran's centrifuge component workshop, which did damage the ability of the Iranians to produce centrifuges. It also led them to start producing 60% enriched uranium and to start, building its centrifuges in underground facilities and not telling people where they are going. So there is a persistent pattern on the Iranian side to respond in that sort of way. And that fits actually what we've seen in at least one other case in the Middle East, which is that of Iraq, where the Israelis were very successful in attacking the Iraqi reactor in 1981. It did set back the Iraqi, nuclear weapons program, at least as relates to that reactor. But as many, scholar researchers have demonstrated subsequently, and as we found after the first Gulf War, the Iraqis reconstituted that program and actually put a lot more oomph into it. And that's the fear that you have when you're thinking about military action against Iran. Now, that said, you really do find yourself in a question of if your choice truly is Iran with nuclear weapons or military strikes that are required to impede that taking place time and time again until a future diplomatic structure can be reached or until frankly regime change or other things. That's a choice that U.S. presidents have to this date have indicated they'd be prepared to make and to use military force. That's why you've had every president going back now 25 years say Iran having nuclear weapons is unacceptable and they'd be prepared to do what it takes. We haven't seen that tested. And the reality is, Kelsey laid at the beginning, is we're now closer to Iranian nuclear weapons than we've ever been before. So as I've written about before, I am not excited by the idea of military action against Iran. I think it'd be a profound mistake. I also think it'd be a profound mistake to allow Iran to possess nuclear weapons because of the regional ramifications, because of what would happen vis-a-vis Iran itself, all the implications that come thereafter. So it is a choice that I would be prepared to make, but I don't enter it with any sense of optimism. And in fact, quite the opposite. I think what would be required is not only one set of attacks, but a series of attacks taking place over a long period of time that would probably spiral out. And that goes to your fundamental question of what happens in the region. The Iranians have been very clear that they would not just take their retaliation against the United States, but against anyone who is seen as enabling it. Obviously, that would probably include the Israelis, might include regional states, that are housing U.S. military bases like Qatar. So, what the Iranians would choose to do and how that would spiral out is quite significant. And so, this is why we come back to a deal that does not solve all of our problems permanently forever and ever, that is wonderful and perfect, may not be in the cards, but still may be a better choice than military action, even if military action still, at least to some people, remains preferable to Iran possessing nuclear weapons without having been challenged on something the United States has established for many years, is something we consider to be a significant threat to our security.
Thanks, Richard. Sina, Richard mentioned the regional ramifications of, a military attack, but generally whether negotiations succeed or fail, there are going to be broader implications on the region. So can you talk a little bit about how the other countries in the area and countries around the world are viewing this particular negotiation?
Yeah, I think when it comes to this negotiation and the prospect of military strikes, I mean, there's multiple additional things I would consider. One would be this issue of verification, where, as we've talked about here, that diplomatic deal, well, Iran agrees under the terms of a deal to voluntarily degrade its nuclear capacity. That could be verified and comprehensively verified by the IAEA, by the US potentially. We'll see however form a deal potentially takes place. But a military attack would also run into this problem of verification, that this Iranian nuclear program is spread out across the country. Yes, I mean, we obviously know where all the declared sites are, but they could move stuff around. They have, many scientists. The knowledge obviously exists there. That threat of Iran using the excuse of a military attack to kind of, at that point, really dash for the bomb. And the estimates I've seen, that have been citing kind of US government estimates, are that a military strike would set back Iran's nuclear program months to, at best, a year. And you can easily imagine in that kind of scenario that Iran would dash for the bomb in a covert way. And, I think, assuming we have 100% knowledge of where Iran's nuclear material is, where the infrastructure is, I think that's, fanciful. And there are also lessons that the wars since October 7th provide for us, that we know that, for example, the Houthis, who have been under intense bombardment by the US, who've been, under siege basically for decade plus, prior to that Saudi-led coalition, that there was this interesting New York Times report the other day talking about how, their air defenses, the Houthi air defenses, shot down many US MQ-9 Reaper drones, almost shot down an F-35, almost shot down F-18. And they targeted US aircraft carriers. And there was also a line about how US intelligence estimates that they're somewhat degraded, the Houthis, but they can quickly reconstitute. And I think there's a similar lesson to Hezbollah, that yes, Hezbollah was battered severely, but right up until the November ceasefire, that they were consistently firing a similar amount of rockets and missiles into Israel and drones every day. They were targeting Tel Aviv right up until the day before the ceasefire. And so the lessons for me on Iran is, this idea that we can go in and take them out in a decisive, verifiable way for the long term. That seems to be kind of wishful thinking. And like Richard said, the most likely scenario is this kind of continued strikes leading us to another kind of endless war type situation that Trump wants to avoid. And that's to say nothing about Iran's retaliation. We know at this point, we have multiple examples of Iranian missiles, like going back to 2019. I mean, Iran, whether that was Iran or the Houthis who attacked the Saudi oil refineries in 2019, it was a seemingly a cruise missile and drone strike that was precise, hit their oil refineries in 2020. They hit the base hosting US soldiers in Iraq after Qasem Soleimani was assassinated. We know, according to former US commanders, 60 Minutes did a segment on it, that those strikes were pretty precise. They hit hangars, they hit helicopters, they destroyed, various targets at that base. And then, so these are, I think on the short range, at least, that Iranian missiles and drones can cause serious damage. In the long range, to Israel, we've seen two examples in 2024 in April and October. I think we are still in a situation of fog of war regarding exactly what happened there. But in the October strike, we know that certain, Iran, at least, for example, had 40 impacts on the Nebatim Air Base, which is a 50 square kilometer big air base in Israel. We know that there were secondary explosions at Tel Naf, another US Israeli base, and there was a strike near the Mossad headquarters that was I think 500 meters away from it. There's debates about the accuracy, there was assumptions about what their targets were and how far away they were from those targets. But the point is that they've proven, I would argue, that they can, through saturation strikes, overwhelm the multi-layered American, Israeli kind of regional air defenses and cause damage. So in the event of an all-out war, we enter this discussion about what is Iran's threshold for a major response. If its nuclear sites get hit, is it going to hit back in a big way? If its critical infrastructure gets hit, its refineries, its ports, its power plants. But in those circumstances, I think Khamenei has proven in all these strikes since 2019 that his risk calculus is less risk averse than previously thought, that he's willing to take these kind of actions. He's willing to risk killing lots of Israelis and Americans and, Arabs. And so I think, this could potentially be a very costly conflict. And I think that's one reason why, to your point about the regional countries and situation, where all these countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, UAE, they don't want war with Iran. I think one lesson of them from Trump's first term, where they were very gung-ho on maximum pressure, was they kind of wanted the US to come in the region, stay in the region, kind of take out or contain or keep Iran in the penalty box in perpetuity for them. But then once they saw the costs for themselves, when their oil tankers were being targeted, their oil refineries were being targeted, and the US was not willing to come in and go to war with Iran on their behalf, they pivoted towards engagement and detente with Iran. And now they're saying that they're not going to allow the US to use their territories for an attack on Iran, like all these bases that the US has in Qatar and elsewhere. And that's going to be a limiting factor to a US attack on Iran. If they can't launch like B-2s, B-52s from the bases, they're going to have to rely on Diego Garcia. They're going to have to rely on aircraft carriers, which can't really sustain those kind of levels of heavy bombing campaigns. And so it's going to be limiting. So I think there's a lot of issues with this idea of a military solution, that it's not going to be tenable. And the alternative of a deal that Trump says he wants, Iran says they want, that could lead to much more durable, lasting solution to this that's verifiable and can also lay the groundwork for a new regional order centered on, as we've discussed, potentially more deeper cooperation between all the Persian Gulf states.
Excellent. So a great description of kind of how we got here, where we are now, the implications of a potential military option. It sounds like all of you agree the best possible option here is to find a deal, a durable deal. So one of the questions that we have from the audience is from James Larimore. He asks, the JCPOA involved other states. Is the US sort of alone now, or what role do those other states play, particularly the UN Security Council and then the P5+1, which was the 5 members of the Security Council plus the EU? And I'll start with Kelsey here. Also, can you talk about also the role of the IAEA? You talked about that briefly, but how important is the IAEA, the strength and the support of the IAEA important to this process?
Sure. So I'll start with that last question first, the IAEA, because it really is quite critical. I mean, any nuclear agreement, needs to be monitored and verified by the IAEA. They have the continuity of experience in Iran. They have the expertise. And it's part of their mandate, to ensure that that nuclear programs are entirely peaceful. And I think it is much more likely to be amenable that the IAEA verify in Iran than having the United States try to verify agreement, which is something that I think was been discussed amongst Trump administration officials. So supporting the IAEA, ensuring that they have the resources they need, that's also something that the United States should be thinking about during this period. Now, in terms of other multilateral actors, I would like to see the United States more engaged with the E3 on the issue of Iran and the nuclear negotiations. I don't think they necessarily have to be in the room for talks. I think the Iranians are quite frustrated with the Europeans. The Europeans tried to deliver on the JCPOA after the US withdrew. That failed. There are other issues that are complicating the European-Iranian relationship, such as Iran's support for Russia, that are legitimate concerns on the European side and quite sensitive. But the Europeans have been engaged with Iran. They do have some continuity and deep expertise. But ultimately, it is the United States and the US sanctions that Iran is looking for relief from. And only the United States can really clear the way for the type of relief that Iran is looking for and the type of investment that Iran is looking for. So while I think it would be good for the United States to consider the roles that other countries could play in supporting an agreement, I think the Gulf, for instance, is uniquely positioned to help support sanctions relief and investment, as well as some of the nuclear cooperative activities I described earlier. This is ultimately going to be a conversation, between the United States and Iran. Would I like to see the Security Council, endorse any type of deal? Absolutely. But I think we do have to be honest about the limits of what that can provide from a guarantee perspective. I mean, the UN Security Council endorsed the JCPOA. That didn't stop the Trump administration from withdrawing, despite Iran's compliance. Even if this deal were pursued as a treaty, that's not going to close off US options for withdrawing in the future. I mean, there is no way to really kind of ensure that, this deal is sort of durable kind of no matter what. But I do think if we think more creatively about some of the incentives, if we increase some of the economic ties between the US and Iran, that could help with kind of durability and sustainability, of an agreement on both sides.
Appreciate that, Kelsey. Richard, one of the roles that other countries were playing in the lead up to the JCPOA was participating in broad-based sanctions. And you talked a little bit in your opening statement about that, but can you talk a little bit more about how sanctions may be used as a tool now, the limitations of that tool, and as we mentioned a little bit before, why can't you just have these things forever?
Well, I mean, so a couple of things that are worth saying. First on how other countries played in the sanctions game. I mean, up until 2010, the international sanctions against Iran were largely being dictated out of Washington with some amount of support from the UN Security Council. But the Security Council resolutions that we negotiated largely focused on nuclear and missile related pieces. There were some things that had economic impact, but it was less, candidly. 2010 changed that because for the first time, we were able to secure in the Security Council resolution language that specifically dealt with energy related transactions, as well as heightened vigilance with regard to financial and other transactions with Iran, that gave a platform for those in the EU, Japan, Korea, and other places to start augmenting UN sanctions with their own measures. Now, that didn't happen, automatically, nor did that happen just because, we did an awful lot of work to make sure that that was going to happen and made sure that there was language in the UN Security Council Resolution 1929 that gave that kind of space. Again, the language there was chosen for a reason and was then used by all those different partners. But even then, a lot of the sanctions pressure that was being put on the Iranians still came from the threat of countries having their banks essentially and their energy companies secondarily isolated from the United States. And we augmented that threat with additional sanctions in 2012 and 2013. The result of all that was when the United States withdrew from the JCPOA in 2018, started reimposing sanctions, there was still sanctions relief being provided by Europeans and Japanese and Koreans and others. But it didn't really matter because at the end of the day, their financial institutions and their companies were still afraid of being isolated from the United States. And so they didn't get really back into Iran in any kind of serious way. People who had decided that they were going to withdraw, big energy companies like Total. So I think where we are now is, as Kelsey said, U.S. sanctions are still the name of the game. That if the U.S. provides sanctions relief, that'll provide space for financial actors in Europe and other places to go back into Iran to make the kinds of investments they want to make. I'm actually personally skeptical you'll have a lot of U.S. companies take advantage of even sanctions relief that affected the U.S. primary embargo. There's still a lot of baggage involving Iran, political. There's still a lot of economic issues. There's plain simple security issues. If you're a U.S. person traveling to Iran, especially of Iranian descent, you might find yourself in prison by the IRGC because there's an awful lot of factionalism inside of Iran as well. A lot of people who aren't going to be satisfied with any deal that's reached with the United States, especially if it limits Iranian freedom of action. I think that's worth all of us remembering here. We tend to think because everything reverberates around Washington nowadays, but Tehran has politics too. Its politics can be incredibly toxic. And there are a lot of people who spent time in jail, even though they were trying to advance the Rouhani administration's efforts at economic integration because of the factionalism inside of Iran. Which all goes back to the question of what happens in a sanctions relief scenario. I think you would see some European, some Japanese, some Korean, certainly a lot of Chinese and Russian uptake in business inside of Iran, but a lot of it will be dictated by Iranian factors, whether or not they're providing the kinds of safe environments that are required for people to operate, both physically safe as well as financially safe. Worth noting, actually, I think it came out literally as we started this seminar that the Iranian Expediency Council has agreed to allow Iran to join the Palermo Convention, which has to do with financial crime and anti-money laundering and terrorist financing restrictions. That is indicative of an Iran that's trying to make itself a little bit more hospitable to international banking. So perhaps they're looking ahead to that kind of space, or at least trying to limit the arguments there. But all this comes back to a question of what's the Iranian incentive here. And I think you asked what more can sanctions do in this space. Frankly, the Trump administration has made very clear that it wants to have maximum pressure, it wants to push on maximum pressure, but it doesn't have the capacity to generate much more pressure on the Iranian system that's not already in place, at least not without going after major Chinese financial institutions that are funneling oil money back to Iran. And that's the name of the game right now. If the United States isn't prepared to take on those financial institutions, you're not going to have much more done in that space. So, you're in a race in which the sanctions tool maybe has less potency than it had in the past against an Iranian nuclear program that is demonstrating significant potency. And that's part of the reason why at some point sanctions become a wasting asset, and it's time for them to be dispositioned for something that provides more security benefits, like a deal.
Yeah, I think sometimes people think of sanctions as sort of a magic wand of we can just sanction them and that will produce a result. And we haven't necessarily seen a lot of evidentiary support for that. I'm going to come back to you in a minute on snapbacks because I think that's something that people see in the news a lot, don't necessarily have all the content behind. But want to switch to Sina. Barbara Slavin asks, do you think Iran would accept a deal with no sunsets enriching beyond 3.67%? So can you give your view on that, but also sort of explain what that would mean to the layperson?
Yes, thank you, Barbara. In many ways, that is the key question surrounding this issue. So 3.67% would be the level of enrichment suitable only for peaceful purposes and would meet Iran's kind of ostensible self-declared desire to produce its own kind of, to have the fuel cycle and eventually be able to produce its nuclear fuel for its reactor. But, this is a very politically charged and sensitive issue in Iran. And it is just enrichment itself at the at the minimum of 3.67%, that this is Iran views this as a right given by the NPT, which most countries share that view. And it argues that it sacrificed a lot to kind of maintain its enrichment. Adolchi, the foreign minister this week, said that something about like the blood of our scientists was invested in this right. like referring to the scientists who were assassinated. So the question of perpetuity, I think, is potentially there could be more room for maneuverability there, but I think a lot of that would have to do in the overall shape of a deal and what the incentives on the table are for Iran. I think Iran's ultimate goal in a new deal is to have a deal that delivers meaningful sanctions relief and is also hard for the US to leave it in the future. So given this issue of guarantees that Richard laid out, that it's not really tenable for even the Trump administration, even with the treaty ultimately, to give that kind of guarantee, Iran basically wants some level of its nuclear capacity and material, whether that means advanced centrifuges, stockpiles, to kind of remain accessible to it, that in the event that if America left again and America can just snap back its nuclear sanctions, that Iran can just snap back its nuclear infrastructure and it's basically its own bargaining chip and leverage in a more quick way. So I think if that question can be resolved, maybe, yeah, in perpetuity is not that big of an issue for the Iranians, but if they have some kind of framework where they feel like they're going to have some leverage accessible to them, whether that means in Iran under like some international safeguards, or in Russia, or in a joint consortium in the Persian Gulf, like at an island that belongs to Iran, is the proposal I saw floated in the Iranian press, that maybe that can give them enough confidence that leads to some more long-standing or permanent kind of restrictions, but in this framework that they get meaningful relief, and they're also able to kind of snap back their own leverage if needed to deter the US from leaving again.
Thanks, Sina. Moving broad scope again, Manpreet Sethi, who's a Science and Security Board member for the Bulletin, asks, politics have shifted since 2015, as Kelsey noted, but that includes the US and Iran's relationships with Russia and China. So Kelsey, can you talk a little bit about Iran's current relationships with Russia and China and how that would affect this negotiation?
Sure. I think one consequence of the US decision to withdraw from the JCPOA and reimpose sanctions was that it pushed Iran closer to Russia and China. And since then, Iran has strengthened its strategic partnership both with Moscow and Beijing, and the extent to which, with Russia, it's provided, drones and drone technology that Russia has used in its, illegal war against Ukraine, which is, complicated all of which is, I said, complicated negotiations over the nuclear program because of European reactions in part. I think the bottom line though is that while Russia and China may not be willing to proactively use their influence in Tehran to pressure Iran towards a deal, proliferation is not in Russian and Chinese interests. Preventing Iran from withdrawing from the NPT, which it may do if UN Security Council sanctions are reimposed on it, preventing, Russia and China, don't want to see that reality. And I think it's notable that, Putin offered to mediate between the United States and Iran over its nuclear program, and Iran did not seem interested in that. So I think there are concerns in Tehran about how reliable of a partner Russia is, even as we've seen ties, some greater ties and military cooperation between the two countries. And I think all of that still bodes well for Iran's interest in reaching a deal with the United States. But I think it also serves as a caution that the US, particularly as it relates to Russia, should be concerned about Russia perhaps trying to inject its own strategic interests into any type of negotiation. And in my mind, argues for kind of keeping Russia on the periphery of any deal.
Great. Richard, as promised, I'm snapping back to you to talk about snapbacks. I have a couple final questions that I want to make sure we get in. So if you could just quickly explain to people what is a snapback and how does it apply here? How can it be used, or how can it be an impediment?
Basically, when we did the JCPOA, we were really concerned that the Iranians would cheat on the deal and we wouldn't be able to reimpose UN sanctions because of opposition from Russia and China and debate that might be happening about whether or not Iran was actually cheating on the deal. So we designed into Resolution 2231 essentially a veto enabling process whereby if one JCPOA participant said, we think Iran's cheating, a resolution gets put before the council to continue the sanctions relief. And obviously, if one of the permanent members decides to veto it, then sanctions relief goes, doesn't get continued and sanctions get reimposed. So the theory behind snapback is that it would be a trigger that would be available to the JCPOA participants, but especially the veto holders, essentially for as long as the provision was operative. It was agreed in the JCPOA would last for 10 years after adoption day, which was set as October 18th, 2015, which means October 18th, 2025 is when that provision were to go away. The process defined Security Council Resolution 2231 is that 30 days beforehand, before a resolution could be voted upon, you have to submit a notification to the council that basically says we want to reimpose the sanctions because we think Iran is cheating. So what that all means functionally is that by about September 18th, 2025, if the United States or any of its European partners wanted to reimpose UN sanctions against Iran, they have until then to prompt it. And then to have a resolution voted on that they can veto and reimpose those sanctions.
Thanks, Richard. I think it's something that people hear about a lot and don't necessarily have the background. I'm going to do a lightning round for everyone because we've got some really great questions. We'll start back with you, Kelsey. There's some questions about whether or not this effort should be connected to the effort to create a Middle East weapons of mass destruction free zone, and whether the whole idea of denuclearization of this region or the elimination of weapons of mass destruction is a viable goal. And I will add one to that. Is this the kind of conversation that could involve, say, mass accession to the CTBT, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, of which 4 countries in the region are not full members yet?
So I think the creation of a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East is an aspirational goal, but practically this is not a treaty or a zone that we are going to see concrete movement on, in the immediate future, and certainly not swiftly enough to address the very urgent risk posed by Iran's nuclear program. I mean, a WMD free zone in the Middle East has its own politics between the Arab League and Israel. It would cover nuclear, chemical, biological, missiles, issues that are extremely difficult to monitor and verify. So while I think it's an important to keep those conversations going, this isn't going to address the Iran crisis, but addressing the Iran crisis could pave the way, towards that Middle East WMD free zone, provide some innovative ideas that could spur those conversations, of which I think, the CTBT, certainly should be, one aspect that's included.
All right, Sina, we're giving you another technical question from Rob Sokolow, who's also on our Science and Security Board. He asked, what are possible dispositions of 60% enriched fuel in Iran? Is it about 600 kilograms?
So by dispositions, it means what kind of potential uses, or Iran, how it's trying to justify having this? Yeah, so there's, Kelsey would honestly know this better. Yeah, okay, Kelsey would know this better than me. From my understanding, the Iranians justified this as, potential future need for like nuclear submarines or things that they basically say that they would need kind of close to weapons grade. But in reality, it is, it's this threshold nuclear weapons capacity that they have been wanting to get to, as, whether one can debate whether that the idea behind Iran wanting this threshold nuclear capacity is to basically use it as a bargaining chip for recognition and from the West and kind of removing tensions and kind of the Islamic Republic kind of entrenching itself, or to just make the dash for the nuclear weapon, or both. But yeah, I think they come up with various basically excuses for why they need these different levels. Even for 90%, I've heard Iranian kind of more hardline commentators say, yeah, for this XYZ peaceful thing, we need 90%. We should go to weapons grade. But in reality, it's, to improve their leverage and really shorten the time they would need to dash for the bomb if they made that decision.
All right, Richard, I'll leave the absolute easiest question for you. So Congress played a quite pivotal role in JCPOA. What do you think this particular Congress is expecting in terms of deal? How will they respond to it? Are they more likely to be positive because the majority in the House and the Senate is of the same party as the president this time?
Well, look, it's certainly an advantage, and the reality is that there's probably a fair number of Democrats who would sign on to a deal with the Iranians too. In addition to Republicans who could be, whipped into it by the House and the Senate leadership to get them to join on. So I think it's an advantage that's accruing there. I think it really does depend on the terms. If it's a complete sweetheart deal from Trump to the Iranians, it allows them to essentially have everything aside from some verification of nuclear weaponization not happening. I think that would be hard even for Trump to be able to sustain. There was criticism when some of these ideas are being floated back in the first term, and when some of these discussions were happening with the North Koreans. I think the reality is that it would run into those issues primarily if the Israelis are opposed, primarily if the terms don't look terribly good, primarily if there's a lot of reluctance to provide a lot of sanctions relief. But I think ultimately he can probably sustain that support because he has the ability to whip the Republicans, and there is much more of an isolationist stain right now that doesn't want to take military action. So he's got some advantages built in.
Great. This has been an absolutely fantastic panel. So much great information. I think we could have kept going for much longer. I want to thank our speakers for being a part of this. Thank you all for joining. Our next virtual event is on June 6th. We'll be discussing how we might stop or start the next pandemic. And that's focused on our latest issue of our premium magazine. That's available on our website. So please subscribe to the magazine, to our newsletter, and please keep reading the bulletin. We will have breaking news and the critical expert analysis on the issue of Iran and more, and really want to make sure that people are getting the right information about all these critical issues that affect us all. So thanks to our panel. Thanks to everyone who is here today, and hope to see you on June 6th.